Good afternoon, everyone. President of Tel Aviv University, Professor Yosef Klefter, distinguished Dan David laureates, Ariel David, and distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It is a pleasure and an honor to open our symposium on bioethics with the laureates of the Dan David Prize. And before we begin, I would like to ask the president of the university to say a few words, please.
I'm always happy to be limited to few words. So, dear Dan David Prize laureates, speakers, guests, Professor Shai Lavi, the chairman of the session here. One of the nice traditions around the Dan David Prize ceremony has been organizing this symposia or workshops focusing on the specifics of each of the time dimensions. And in this case is the present time dimension, bioethics. And this idea is, of course, in order to expose leading scholars, researchers, experts to the university faculty and students, and of course also to other Israeli academia. So even in this era of which is very digital, face-to-face discussions and personal touch still has some value and might even create some real cooperations later on. Now, from my point of view, the uniqueness of the Dan David Prize is being open to unconventional and interdisciplinary fields of study and research that other awards, if you check their lists, the possibility to include these areas doesn't exist. And if I went a little bit over the Dan David Prize areas or fields. A few years ago, we awarded combating poverty, a very major global problem, which you won't find on any other award. As Ariel, who is here, mentioned, next year we'll have Defending Democracy. I don't see any other award that defends democracy. Or the other one is Combating Climate Changes. And all these examples, including bioethics, are really global challenges that definitely need more than one approach, more than one discipline, and even cover different communities, different societies, and even include different political views. They all also depend on political approaches. Now, here at Tel Aviv University, we have some bioethical related initiatives. We have the Herzog Institute of Aging, and a few years ago, Shai, if you remember, we inaugurated the Minerva Center for Interdisciplinary Studies of the End of Life. I remember I took part in inauguration, and it was sponsored by German funds. And to me, German funds with end of life, it was a little bit, I would say, sensitive. Moreover, strangely enough, one of the visitors from Germany was a minister of education who very shortly after had to quit because of plagiarism. So this is from bioethics to ethics. So which shows how rich is the whole field here. And of course, we have something which is extremely ethical, and this is the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics that you were the first head of before you moved the baton to somebody else. And again, we have in parallel something that many universities have, and this is all these initiatives on healthy aging and related stuff that really again global and cover many things. So I really think that it's a very important global issue, touches on everyone, and all I can tell you is just that I hope the symposium will be interesting, fruitful, but I cannot resist before I finish to comment on another ethics issue, and this is related to an ethical code that our government tries to impose on universities, which might restrict, I would say a bit to be polite, restrict our freedom of speech and expression. This is something which is heavily discussed by the government. We resist, but it hasn't settled yet. And I would like to say that before we can solve bioethical issues, we need to get rid of ethical code that prevent us from solving ethical issues. So enjoy.
Thank you very much, Professor Josef Klafter, President of the University. Let me begin with saying a few words about the context of the prize and then present the format for this afternoon. Bioethics, as you all know, is a very, or I'd say relatively, new area of study and activity, which cannot be said to have existed in any form recognized today before the second half of the 20th century. In the decades since, bioethics has developed into an independent and exciting field of research. Alongside, it has come to occupy a central role in both science and society, and can and does function as both a gatekeeper and a facilitator of human progress. The Dan David Prize in Bioethics 2018 is the first ever major global prize for bioethics. The prize, in this sense, is an important milestone in the maturation of the field of bioethics. It is in this spirit, and with great honor and pleasure, that I would like to congratulate our three laureates, Professor Ezekiel Emanuel, Professor Jonathan Glover, and Baroness Mary Warnock. All three have made an original, distinctive, lasting, and valuable contribution to the field of bioethics as a field of study, in their scholarship and research. Equally, the laureates, each in her or his own way, have also contributed not only to the realm of ideas, but also to public engagement, policy making, and education. On Sunday, some of you were present, we had a very festive and quite impressive event awarding the prizes. Today, we would like to have a somewhat less formal discussion with the Dan David laureates. And the format that we have planned, as you have seen in the invitation, is by way of a conversation, which we thought would be conducive to this kind of discussion of questions that are of utmost importance, not only in research, but also to a wider public. I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor David Head, who had the wonderful idea of this format, and Professor Yael Shiloni, who has graciously agreed to join this endeavor. This is also a good opportunity to thank the members of the review committee of the Dan David Prize, its chair, Professor John Harris, Professor Inez Befort, and Professor Thomasine Kushner. It was a great pleasure and honor to serve with them on the committee. Special gratitudes obviously go to the Dan David Prize, to Gabriela and Ariel David, and in memory of the inspiring legacy of Mr. Dan David, a great man indeed. And Ariel is here with us. Gabriela, I was told, could not join us because she is taking a class. She's a student in addition to everything else. And so she would not miss class even for an event as important as this. And as a university professor, I cherish that very much. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Smadal Schiffer. Where are you, Smadal? Fish, sorry. Yes, I said. Oh, sorry, Smedal Fisher. It says for all the wonderful work that she's put into this. I will present the laureates and their interlocutors in order of appearance and as we go along. So our first engagement is with the work of the Baroness Marie Warnock. Baroness Warnock is an English philosopher of morality, education, and mind, spent many years at Oxford. Baroness Warnock has had a leading role in the development of practical bioethics, specifically for her progressive and unparalleled contribution to the ethics of embryology and genetics and their ethical and philosophical implications to reproductive technology and disability studies, among others. Mary Warnock has produced a stunning series of more than 13 monographs of the first quality over the past 55 years, from ethics since 1900s, published in 1960 through Women's Philosophers in 1986, Dishonest to God in 2010, and most recently, if I may say so, at the age of 91, critical reflections on ownership. Her seminal and unparalleled achievements was highly known to not only to the experts in bioethics, but to a much broader audience. The Warnock Report on Human Fertilization and Embryology in 1984, which he chaired and guided through to legislation and adoption. This established a framework for a national consensus in the UK on embryo research and proposed a so-called 14-day rule for a permissible window of ethical embryo experimentation, and heralded the setting up of a permanent licensing and review body. This was a major breakthrough not only in the UK, but really set an example of how to reach public consensus on highly controversial bioethical questions. It was not only the force of Baroness Warnock's rational advocacy, but her heroic consensus building, both in Parliament in the UK and society and globally, that has permanently changed both the face of science and the agenda of bioethics. And this is alongside with many more achievements in the field of philosophy, a bit about which we will soon hear. Discussing with Baroness Warnock is my dear friend and colleague, Professor Yaela Shiloni Dolev from the Tel Aviv Yafo College, herself an expert and with path-breaking work in the field of sociology, of bioethics, and reproductive technologies. Thank you. Please.
Okay, now? Okay. So thank you again, Shai, Professor Lavi. I'm very grateful and honored for being here, especially with you, Baroness Mary Warnock. And I would like to first of all ask about the 14-day rule. One of the major achievements of the Warnock Committee was a rule which was endorsed globally that no embryo may be kept alive in a laboratory for more than 14 days. It has set a limit that most members of society were happy with, and within this limit, scientists were able to learn a lot. Recently, a debate has opened up concerning this rule, suggesting that the ban should be lifted. You said the choice of 14 days was somewhat arbitrary, but important to keep against the slippery slope. What are your thoughts concerning the recent debate?
Thank you for that question, because I think it's quite important.
Maybe it's not open.
Thank you. I believe that the 14-day rule was actually one of the most important things that made it possible for our report to be converted into law. I think if we hadn't had that limit on how long an embryo could be kept alive in the laboratory, we would never have got that bill through Parliament and the legislation wouldn't have existed. So I do regard it as one of the most important things. It was, to some extent, an arbitrary limit, but it followed more or less what we then knew about the development of the very early embryo in the uterus, because after 14 days, the development of the embryo becomes much more rapid. And after 14 days, there begins to develop a sort of plate of cells that adhere together quite closely and which ultimately turn into the central nervous system. Before 14 days, there's no sign of a central nervous system, and therefore, of course, no sign of sentience in the embryo at all. So we learned a lot on the committee. In fact, I knew nothing about embryology at all when I took the chair on the first day. But we had a marvellous scientist called Anne McLaren, who taught us, all members of the committee, a great deal about the development of the embryo. And it became clear that after 14 days, when gradually the central nervous system begins to develop, only gradually after that, but development is fast after 14 days. So 14 days seemed like a good idea. And the thing that I insisted on was that it should be a number of days and not a stage of development of the embryo, because I could well imagine some scientists saying, well, my embryo is a slow developer and he hasn't got to this stage yet, so let's have a bit longer for him or her. But I wanted to avoid that at all costs, and I wanted certainty, because by then we knew that we were going to recommend legislation to ministers and not mere guidelines from the medical profession, but proper legislation. And therefore, the one thing that legislation requires is certainty. And I think everybody can count up to 14, and I think everybody can keep records of when the embryo actually was alive and fertilized. So there ought to have been, and was, I think, no doubt about when that stage of 14 days had been reached. So therefore it seemed uncontroversial and perfectly safe, in the sense that the embryo couldn't possibly suffer for quite a long time after 14 days. We were erring on the side of caution. And that was how the 14-day rule came into being. And as I say, I'm perfectly certain that we should have not have got the legislation through Parliament without that restrictive rule. And although one of the doctors who was the author, so to speak, of the first test tube baby, as they were called, was someone called Dr. Bob Edwards, who was a very brilliant but extremely incautious man. He, from the beginning, longed to have more than 14 days. Nevertheless, he was restrained by the law and he couldn't. So I was always thankful for that. So now the question has arisen of whether that limit ought to be restricted, ought to be extended. But the fact of the matter is that until 2013, no embryo had been kept alive in the laboratory for longer than 5 days, and the average time that an embryo had been kept alive was 3 days. So it was only in 2013 that someone managed to keep an embryo alive until 13 days when it had to be destroyed. And so we haven't had very long when that whole period between 5 days and 13 days has been exploited in research. And my opinion is actually that we ought to wait for a bit until quite a lot of more work has been done, observing and using embryos between 5 days and 13 days, because quite a lot can be discovered about embryonic development during that time. And my reason for saying that we should wait and not extend the limit yet, we may extend it later, is simply a pragmatic one, because I'm perfectly certain that if somebody now said we're going to have 21 days as the limit, say, or any number of days more than 14, the opposition party, which is very powerful to embryonic research at all, would marshal their forces and say, this is exactly what we foresaw. As soon as it became possible to keep an embryo alive for 14 days, look what's happened. They're going to extend this is what we thought all the time. And so they would put up a fight against this. And I have to say that in the UK, every time any amendment or change has been debated in Parliament, these forces of opposition have marshalled their forces and have been very powerful. And there is a number of opponents in Parliament, in both houses, and they would fight against any extension. And I think that, not looking too far into the future, there's a lot of work that embryologists can do on embryos up to 14 days that hasn't been possible before and is possible now. So that is my reason for opposing the change. I don't say forever, but for the time being.
I would like to ask now about women in science and policy. The Warnock Report has been hailed as an exemplar of public engagement in science. You said that choosing a philosopher rather than a biology scientist to head the committee was a wise decision. Would you say that choosing a woman, if I'm not mistaken, mother of 5, to that position, dealing with issues of human fertilization and embryology, mattered no less?
Certainly not. No. I think it's possible that a woman might have more sympathy with women who are infertile. I think infertility is a terrible burden for those people who really want to start a family. And it's a particularly awful sort of burden because in most cases, people don't know that they're infertile. They have to wait month by month to prove that it is so. And it's a very harrowing situation. And it's possible that a woman in the chair might have more sympathy with that, but I doubt it, because I think all gynecologists, male or female, have great sympathy with women who want to start a family and can't. And so do the general public, especially people who rejoice in a family themselves, and they really do feel sorry for those people who want to do that and can't. So I don't think it really made any difference whether the chairman was a man or a woman. But I do repeat what I said, that I think it was a good thing that it was neither a lawyer nor any member of the medical profession, because I think that a philosopher is likely to be trusted to be impartial, because philosophers don't have any vested interest in any subject, really. You could say they didn't have any subject at all, but they are quite good at picking up the issues that arise out of other people's subjects. So I think philosophy was a good choice.
Okay. My next question is about religion. Your work in the United Kingdom bridge divides between scientists, politicians, clergy, and the general public. Israel declares itself to be a Jewish state, and indeed, bioethics here is highly informed by religious thinking. Could you share with us some tips for your enormous success in bridging bioethical divides between opponents, especially between religious leaders and scientists?
Well, that's an interesting question. Don't think I can give you any tips because I was, on the whole, lucky. In one respect, I was lucky. There was a day when the then chief rabbi published an article in the Times after our report was published, which was headed, "Warnock destroys morality." That was a great source of pleasure to my husband. Because I was at the time a very rogue footballer called Warnock, who'd been expelled from his team and had left the country and so on. So the headline was quite interesting. But I was enormously helped, or the bill's passage through Parliament was enormously helped by the fact that the House of Lords, where the bill started, has, as you probably know, a representation of the Anglican Church and the bishops' bench. And there are bishops sitting in the House of Lords in rotation, but the two bishops who are there all the time are the two senior bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. And the then Archbishop of York had started his career as a biologist. He had taught in Cambridge as a biologist, and he had changed careers when he was probably in his 40s. And he was at heart a biologist. And he gave a marvelous speech in the House of Lords, which I always remember, in which people were raising the question, when does life begin? And therefore, when ought we to respect life and not use embryos for experimentation? And he began his speech with the words, "I am a biologist, and therefore I'm a gradualist, and I believe that the development of the embryo is a gradual process where we can choose when we respect it as we respect a child who has been born, and when we may use it experimentally." And those words were really very significantly important in getting the bill through. So I felt always hugely grateful to him, who became a great friend. But he, of course, didn't represent the whole of religious opinion. There were numerous people who were of the opinion that we were recommending that doctors play God and produce babies where babies were not meant to be produced, and so on. But on the whole, there is a hierarchy in the Church of England, and the archbishops, the two archbishops, Canterbury and York, are respected very much. And so the fact that this lapsed biologist was Archbishop of York, I think, had a huge effect on the Church as a whole, not just those bishops who were in Parliament, but on the Church of England, and not on the Roman Catholic Church, I may say, but on the Church of England and other non-Catholic Christian religions. But the Jewish faith never came along with us, and as I've said, I was accused by the chief rabbi of having destroyed morality, and he was very vocal. Then chief rabbi was a member of the House of Lords, and he was very vocal against the bill going through. So I can't give you any tips. I think you're up against it.
So maybe some tips about the next subject. The next subject is humanities and the social science crisis. In your work, you have engaged philosophy and the social sciences in public policy in a fascinating manner. It made philosophy practically relevant with its extraordinary contribution for supporting research while ensuring public accountability. However, today, I sadly observe that science, technology, and industry keep advancing rapidly, while the humanities, along with the social sciences, are going through a crisis of trust and popularity. Do you, first of all, share this observation? And if so, as a world leader in making our fields relevant, how do you understand this state of affairs? And do you have any thoughts regarding what can be done to make us more relevant?
Well, if I can answer your second question first, your last question first, I don't see any easy way, at any rate, of making the social sciences and the humanities more relevant, or I should say, more accurately, I don't see a way of making them seem to be more relevant, because in fact they are relevant. I don't believe that any society which over a long period of time starves the social sciences and the humanities of funding, which is at the root of the problem, that any society can call itself a civilized society. I do believe that it's completely necessary that we support and we financially support the humanities and the social sciences. Because if you reflect on what is studied in universities under those headings, and you imagine universities existing where those studies didn't exist at all, you would be faced with an extraordinarily diminished society. So I do believe that supporting and manifestly believing in the studies of the humanities is crucial to a civilized society. But I also think that at a purely practical level, it is enormously important that we have graduates who know how to express themselves, who know how to write, who know how to teach, who know how to be responsible journalists. And there is an enormous number of people, including civil servants and journalists above all, who really require this kind of education that universities can give in the humanities. So I think it's an incredibly short-sighted policy of governments, wherever they are, to starve the humanities and social sciences of money, and if in some sad cases leave them out of the universities altogether. I think it's a profound mistake.
Thank you. Could you share with us your experience of your own move from the very theoretical, philosophical work to becoming publicly engaged in more concrete matters?
That would be rather a long story. But I'll cut it short by saying that I was, first of all, approached by a politician, a Labour politician, who, when Labour was in power in the early 70s, to become a member of a body called the South East Economic Planning Council, of which I said yes, because I tend to say yes to anything, but I did say yes, because I quite wanted to get my foot into that kind of work. But it was an intensely boring occupation, that, because it was really a matter of people arguing about whether certain land that had been agricultural land in the southeast should be turned into building sites, and whether bits of the southeast should be amalgamated with other bits of the southeast. And people sat there saying, I've been an inhabitant of the Isle of Wight since I was a boy, and I'm man and boy, and I won't have it, and so on. And so there was a lot of infighting, and I quite soon resigned. But that was my first foot in this world. But once you have been asked to do something like that in the UK, your name goes onto a list referred to colloquially as a list of the great and the good, but in the civil service known simply as the list. And once your name is on the list, you get considered for any job like chairmanship of a committee or membership of a committee, because before chairing this committee, I'd already chaired another committee, and I'd also been a member of a committee concerned with the welfare of animals, which was a committee of the Home Office. Anyway, once you're on the list, you're always one of the people who are going to be considered. And so the way I got onto the list was being shovelled onto it by this Labour politician friend. And then I have certainly been inclined to accept any job that arose from my being on this list that has cropped up, because I greatly enjoy this kind of committee work.
In the early days, when the Warnock report was written, there were many worries that science is moving too fast, and it was hard to distinguish between pure science fiction and the real science of the time. More than 30 years later, having your special experience and looking at new technologies such as gene editing, cheap whole genome sequencing, and the like, are you still confident human society can wisely control its growing abilities as before, or are you somewhat worried?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think there are people, though possibly fewer than there were, who tend to think that science is moving too fast, and that both ordinary people and people who interest themselves in morals and moral philosophy are struggling to catch up with them. And about people started saying that sort of thing, I should think, in the 1960s, certainly in the early 70s, they were busy saying it. And I've never quite known what people think the remedy is. I mean, let's say for a moment that it's true that science moves faster than either ordinary people or moral philosophers can catch up with them, and it's difficult to see the consequences. And I think that Jonathan Glover can tell us a great deal more about that, about the necessity and the wisdom of looking into the future and really thinking seriously about what our attitudes to possible future developments will be. And I don't think we're very good at that. Certainly in the case of embryology, most people didn't know what work was going on in embryology. Only gynecologists and embryologists really knew what was going on. But of course, a lot of work had been going on with working with early embryos. not in the laboratory because they didn't exist, but with embryos that had been aborted by ill chance, and with other materials, and working as far as they could with pregnant women. A lot of work had been going on, and a lot of time had been taken in trying to produce an embryo, trying to produce a fertile egg in the laboratory before the first test tube baby was actually born, so to speak, that the fertilization actually occurred in the laboratory, and then the baby, the embryo was implanted in the uterus. So a great deal of work had gone before. And when the first baby was born that way, the first in the world, in Stockport in north of England, really nobody quite knew what to do, because they suddenly, at that point in 1978, saw that this was going to be a huge development in the future, that it was bound to be replicated, and there was going to be a whole problem. So that was when the government decided, I think properly, that they wanted a committee set up, because no minister of health could rely on his civil servants to provide the evidence and the facts, and above all the evidence from all kinds of people that was required to make a proper legislative decision. So I think that was certainly a case where it was very right to have a committee. But I think it's still true that we're not as good as we should be at considering possible future developments. Because people, the general public and Parliament, feel they've got enough on their plate with things that are actually happening without fussing about what might happen in the future. So I think that actually we ought to get better at it, and we ought to set up possibly as a standing Royal Commission or standing committee that took on considering developments, likely developments in different bioethical fields, or fields that were likely to become a matter of ethics in the biological sciences. I believe that that would be a good and sensible thing. There is a standing Royal Commission in the UK on environmental matters. There could be a standing Royal Commission on this kind of bioethical subject. The only thing is that since the days of Margaret Thatcher, the whole concept of a Royal Commission of any kind, it has gone out of favour. So it would be quite difficult to achieve a standing Royal Commission. But that, I think, is something that ought to be done, because it would help people, newspaper readers and people who are interested in the sciences, and particularly people who are interested in the practical application of the sciences. It would help them to know what was going on if there were, say, a 6-monthly report from this committee, simply to keep the ordinary public up through journalism with what was actually happening. And we have in the UK, and I'm sure you have here, a great number of really responsible scientific journalists who know what they're talking about and take trouble not to exaggerate, not to distort, but actually to get things right. So we could rely on journalists to keep people up to date if we had this kind of commission.
I think this is a wonderful idea, and it has actually answered my next question. And it reminds me that it might be time to mention that here in Israel, we don't even have a National Bioethics Committee anymore. We used to have one, and I was a member of it, but for the last 2 years, it's not meeting anymore. So maybe it should start meeting again, and maybe we could also use your idea. I'm approaching my last questions. Would you like to see a sort of a global committee or a Warnock report, or should different societies have some autonomy regarding regulation?
I don't think there's any case for a global report or a global committee. I mean, one of the reasons for this is that, as you said, as one of our discussions entailed, religion does play an enormous part, and in some societies a greater part than in others. And a global committee would, in a way, be forced to take seriously religious concerns which in their own country weren't particularly important, or could be got over or got round, or one could make friends with religious people, as we indeed did. Up to a point, but only up to a point. But I can imagine many societies where this would be completely impossible. And I think, therefore, the work of such a committee could not go at all smoothly if it represented more than one country at a time. Besides, I feel that these moral questions, ethical questions of this kind, in a democracy, they deserve their own legislation, because I think that, well, my most general observation is that civilized society depends, above all other things, on the rule of law and the confidence that people can have within that society on the rule of law. But I also believe that each society must make its own law. And therefore, I think it would be inappropriate to try to have some sort of rather vague international law that covered all societies. I don't think it would be appropriate. I don't think it would work. And I don't think it would actually win the support of the people who were supposed to govern.
Do you have any lessons or regrets you would like to share for the future?
Well, I have to answer this question by contrasting it with another government committee of inquiry that I chaired before the embryology committee, and that was a committee that was looking into the education of what was then called handicapped children, children with special needs. And that committee of inquiry lasted for 4 years. The committee met for 4 years. And we had people who were knowledgeable and expert in nearly all, certainly all the common disabilities that children may suffer. And we were a very amicable committee. We weren't ever at odds with one another, as the embryology committee were often at odds with one another. But because we all had the same aim, which was to improve the educational possibilities for children who suffered from various kinds of disabilities. But looking back on the report, the first Warnock report on special educational needs, I did fairly soon, and certainly now, think that we made grave errors, really grave errors, and also that all of the things we suggested and all of the things that were implemented cost far more money than we had foreseen, and therefore local authorities and the Department for Education simply didn't implement some of the things we recommended because it was too expensive. So I look back on that and I think I didn't do that terribly well. I made mistakes, which I didn't foresee. Well, I didn't foresee the consequences of what we were doing, and anyway, we didn't get the money that we needed, so to speak. So, in contrast with that experience, I have to say that I don't have the same regrets about the embryology committee. I can't say I really wish we hadn't recommended that because it's been disastrous. I know there are some people, and some of my colleagues in the House of Lords, who think that we were unduly restrictive and that much more could have happened since in the way of genetic work, genetic engineering, and in all the kinds of other ways. They think that we were too restrictive, and they've been inhibited, they feel, since the report came out. But I don't actually, I'm afraid, share this view, and I think that may sound terribly arrogant, but I do believe that we did get it more or less right. And what the most important thing is going right back to the beginning of our conversation, the 14-day rule. If that hadn't been introduced, then there wouldn't have been any of the developments that there have been. And so, by and large, I think I don't regret that. I certainly don't regret setting up the authority, the Human Fertilization Authority, which has done a tremendous job in overseeing changes, in monitoring performance in all clinics and hospitals, both privately funded and public National Health Service clinics. So that, I think, was a move that was necessary. Indeed, it was our very first recommendation on our list of recommendations, that there should be a monitoring and continuously existing committee looking into possible infringements of the law. That, I think, was quite important. So I end on this rather optimistic note that I think things are going both fast and well and for the common good in the field of bioethics that we are interested in.
Thank you very much to the Baroness Mary Warnock and to Professor Yaroshiloni-Dolev. Before you move on, let me just share with you an anecdote from from the backstage. When the committee was discussing potential candidates for the prize, obviously the name of the Baroness Mary Warnock came up, and the only concern that the committee had was whether you would be able to travel at the age of 94 all the way to Israel. We were hesitant because this is one of the conditions of the prize, that the laureates actually are here. And when I met the Baroness this afternoon, and I was thinking to myself, she probably had a very long rest this morning to be prepared for this intense conversation, and I asked her, so did you have a restful day? And she looked at me and said, no, I was running around Jerusalem sightseeing. So thank you very much. We will now have the next exchange. I would like to invite Professor Jonathan Glover and Professor David Head to take the stage. So, you will now hear from an exchange with Jonathan Glover, who is a philosopher. Many years he taught at Oxford University, then moved to King's College London, where he's now Professor Emeritus. Professor Glover has made seminal contributions to theoretical aspects of bioethics. He set many milestones in the field, really setting the agenda, the questions that later generations of scholars would follow, questions concerning end-of-life decision-making, human enhancement, and reproductive technologies. His original work has also spanned to other topics, including human nature, war and the Holocaust, genetic ethics, neuroethics, and questions concerning dilemmas in psychiatry. The originality of his thought is marked by the role he has played in these debates. And as Baroness Mary Warnock has hinted at, he really has been looking into the future, discovering in advance the kind of problems that we would be facing decades later. Professor Glover has written several books on ethics. They will be discussed shortly, but let me just mention some of them: Responsibility, Causing Deaths and Saving Lives, What Sort of People Should There Be, Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, Choosing Children, Genes, Disability and Design, Alien Landscapes, Interpreting Disorders of Mind, most recently. Professor Glover is a fellow of the Hastings Center, as you all know, an independent bioethics research institute in the United States. Professor Glover is also a distinguished research fellow at the Oxford Center for Practical Ethics. He has, in addition to his academic work, he has also contributed to the public discussion of questions of bioethics. And just to give one example, is by BBC Horizon documentary on brave new babies. Though I have known Professor Glover for only 2 days, I can attest that he is also a charming person with a wonderful sense of humor, I must add. And Professor Glover's interlocutor today will be Professor David Head, a philosopher, Israeli leading bioethicist, a professor emeritus from the Hebrew University, and most recently a laureate of the prestigious Emet Prize. Please.
Thank you, Shai, and thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jonathan. I hesitated whether to call this exchange an interview or a conversation, because on one hand, conversation is more pleasant, but then the interlocutors are given equal time or equal status, and we are celebrating today your prize. So I thought it could be an interview, and you'll do most of the talking. But I warn everybody that it will be a very unprofessional interview, because the interviewer is biased and in favor of the interviewee, which is not proper in proper interviews. I've known Jonathan Glover for now 45 years. I was his student in Oxford in the 1970s. Yes, we are that age already. And actually, I took part in a seminar that he co-taught with Jim Griffin and Derek Parfit, which we students were not aware at the time that it would become a mythological, legendary seminar in the history of philosophy in Oxford. And this was really a very formative experience for me and for my other students. They were all very young at the time, energetic, full of ideas. They had different temperaments, but all three of them were thinking about really new, original issues that became the basis for their respective important books. You know, Jim Griffin was Well-Being, and Derek Parfit was Reasons and Persons, and you with your Causing Death and Saving Lives. And we students, for us, it was more of a performance or a show, because usually, you know, even if the teacher is very energetic and articulate, still there are students. But they were three of them talking to each other, very in polemical way, never agreeing on each other, and the seminar was on their own work in progress, which was really a laboratory of ideas in the real, full, genuine sense of the word. So they were really invested in their ideas, and we sat there at the back. I don't remember what our role was, but we had a lovely time. So that is what makes me my credentials, let's say, as an interviewer tonight. So let's go now to conversation, if you like. I remember that in the 1970s in Oxford, the time, let alone in the 60s, when formative years for you in your philosophical education, Oxford wasn't really interested in what we call now applied ethics. The concept did not exist at the time. And till today, I haven't solved that problem between myself, myself, whether there's such a thing. I think Aristotle would have shrugged it off. What do you mean by applied ethics? After all, every ethics should be or is applied if it's genuine ethics. So I wonder, how can that's a more biographical, intellectual biographical question. How did you move from that Oxford general atmosphere into the kind of work which you really started with causing death and saving lives, although you had that book on responsibility, which had already that touch of it, although it was still mainstream Oxford philosophy.
First, can you hear? Oh, good. Because I'm quite capable of talking for 10 minutes without anyone hearing, because the switch hasn't come on. Firstly, the phrase applied ethics. I got used to this phrase because it's been in use among philosophers for quite a long time. But I was once at a conference in New York sitting next to Jim Watson, one of the DNA people, and when somebody said applied ethics, he whispered to me, "You mean most of it isn't even meant to be applied?" I got into it, but I mean, the thing is, when I went to Oxford, I had been interested in philosophy at school as a schoolboy, and I'd been very interested in quite abstract questions like, I noticed that people I knew had utterly different beliefs from each other about religion, about morality, about politics, about whether science was the right way to understand the world. And so I was enormously eager to study philosophy more. And when I arrived at Oxford, there was a huge amount of how do we know anything at all? Do we know other people are conscious? Even slightly dotty sounding questions like, could I feel a pain in someone else's foot? And I was enormously inspired by the sharpness and clarity with which people debated these issues. But at the same time, it was the beginning of the 60s. There had been rather horrible atrocities carried out in Kenya by British colonial people, and there was huge debate about that. There was the question of whether nuclear weapons were justifiable and so on. There were these huge issues, and as an undergraduate, I felt that half of my interests were somehow separated from the other half. I was very lucky because in moral philosophy, I had Alistair MacIntyre as a tutor, who at that stage was a Marxist. He's been everything just about across the ideological spectrum. But at that stage, he was a Marxist, and I hardly agreed with anything which he actually said, but he was constantly challenging, and he did make me feel that philosophy, and particularly ethics, really could be relevant to the real world. So thinking about it, I thought, I should say that first book of mine was my postgraduate thesis. It reads, alas, like a postgraduate thesis. But when I moved on to Causing Death and Saving Lives, I wanted to write something which would reach out to people and stimulate people to think about killing in general. People thought about war, people thought about euthanasia, people thought about abortion, but rarely linked them up. And I wanted to provide a kind of overall view.
Definitely you managed, because as you mentioned in private exchange, I mean, there were a few works on so-called applied ethics before your book, like Philippa Foot, Crowley, and then Thompson on abortion, but your book certainly was the first systematic work on killing and causing death and saving lives, and in that respect was definitely a turning point. I want to go to your next book, What Sort of People Should There Be, because of my personal interest, in which I followed much of your work, and it was for me personally a very important book in forming my ideas about future people and their standing in morality, moral theory. And here I may have a different approach to you, but I want to put a question to you regarding the way you consider the nature of value in general, because you also hesitate between what is called the person affecting view, which was developed by Derek Parfit in the seminar I referred to earlier, and the more impersonal view about good for the world. And that is very relevant for the question about future people. That is the kind of issue which raises, for the first time in the history of philosophy, the question about the nature of value. And you argue for what is called the mixed view, which has both elements in it. Let's put it as in the dramatic way, which is called the last man philosophical experiment. Would the last man on earth, when humanity is going to be irreversibly destroyed, and he or she is going to be the last person, is her his obligation or duty not to destroy, for example, the Mona Lisa, or bomb the Grand Canyon, things we hold as deeply valuable? Would there be any value after the extinction of the human race altogether? That has, I think, implications for the question about the way we treat future people in the more realistic.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that in the last man case, the last human being case, leave aside that there might be alien beings who'd come and rather like the Grand Canyon when they arrive here. Leave aside those kind of issues. Let's suppose that life anywhere in the universe is going to be permanently extinguished. Then I actually don't have an objection to destroying the Mona Lisa as one walks out and shuts the door, or whatever it is. That, in a way, is that because I think that the only things that ultimately matter have to do with conscious beings, particularly human beings, but also animals and other species that may be capable of suffering or of benefiting from. Oh, I'm so sorry. I told you I could do this. Please, shout at me, raise your hands, let me know if I forget again. But on the other hand, I think there are some things which fit Derek Parfit's idea of impersonal values, because Derek Parfit is, as we all know, so brilliant, and one of the original ideas he had was that most of us, very likely, would not exist if the First World War had not happened. I'll just take my own case. My grandmother loved a man who was killed in the First World War, so she couldn't marry him, so she married another man who was my grandfather, and that kind of thing is repeated over and over again. If she'd married someone else, then she wouldn't have had the same daughter who was my mother, and it's highly unlikely that I would have existed. So the point that Derek makes from this rather kind of engaging thought is that the policies we adopt, for instance, towards the environment, are likely to lead to different policies, are likely to lead to different people being born. And over time, it's quite possible that two different policies would result in utterly different populations. So if one chooses the less good one, suppose we choose to go on burning fossil fuels and mess up the environment, if we do that, there won't be anyone in the future generation who is harmed by that, because they wouldn't have existed unless we had adopted this bad policy. And so people who say the only thing that matters is there must be some people who are better off or worse off, that seems wrong, because I want to say, and Derek does, I know too, or sadly did, Derek wanted to say, we should choose the less bad or the better world, even if they're quite different people. And so the particular people being harmed question doesn't arise. So in one way, I want to say, yes, it doesn't matter if people aren't involved, then you burn the Mona Lisa. But on the other hand, I think there are some impersonal principles in a slightly different sense of impersonal.
Well, I think I have better teeth than you have because I can chew the bullet of, the person affecting. I would follow Parfit's original concern with the more actualist kind of person affecting version. But okay, so
I will ignore the insult to British dentistry. But
So let's move now to, which is of course connected to the previous question, but you have developed a lot of interest in neuroethics, and part of your speech the day before yesterday in the prize-winning ceremony was also dedicated to that concern that you have about the future in which we lose control over the kind of people, or maybe not even people in the human beings in the strict sense of the word. I wonder that the first sub-question here is, do you really believe that we neuroscientists can really support their promise to be able at one stage in the future to read thoughts or to find direct correlations between what happens in our brain and what we call mental states, conscious mental states? I don't understand anything about the science of it, but I have serious philosophical doubts about this very principled possibility. And I wonder what your attitude to that is, and if you think there's a principled obstacle here, then maybe your concern should not be overstated or exaggerated.
Yes, okay. You mentioned that book, What Sort of People Should There Be? It was about the future of genetics and the future of neuroscience and the problems they would raise.
Right.
And you're absolutely right that whereas the book, when it first came out, was dismissed as being ludicrously futuristic on all points, most of the genetic stuff has come about. More or less none of the neurofutures or neurodystopias I invented have come about at all. So that just shows that, I think the hype of neuroscience is often much more effective than the actual progress in the subject, as against the genetics, which, well, we saw some striking instances of progress in that kind of science in this week, in these ceremonies. But the thing about thought, could we one day read people's thoughts, and as a result, is there a threat to privacy? I agree that there are very serious problems. I mean, for instance, the experiments, which I briefly mentioned the other day, where it seems that if you get people to watch a film, and then you are recording various activities going on in their brain, and then if you try and, as it were, do clever things with computers, so that you then see if you can rebuild a film from watching their brain activities, all that is about imaging on the whole. It tends to be about imaging. And one thing is that the images currently are extremely blurry and inadequate, but I don't think that's a fatal objection, because television started with blurry, feeble images too. There is, I think, a quite serious problem though, which is that if you primarily think in visual images, or alternatively in verbal imagery, just a sentence, which was you read that I either have I have a picture of a letterbox comes into my mind, an image of a letterbox comes into my mind. What thought is that? Well, it might just be a random image, but it could be, everything depends on how you interpret it. The image might come into my mind because I've suddenly remembered I forgot to post a letter that should be posted. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be how lovely the ancient letterboxes are, and so on. It could be an aesthetic thought. And similarly with words. If I, when you decode my neural activity, if you find me that I'm actually silently saying to myself, oh, to be in England now that April's here, I did actually have that thought in England this April, but it was entirely ironical because we had a lousy April this year. Whether it's climate change or not, I don't know. But if you just had the words, you wouldn't know what interpretation to place on it. Now, it may be that the obviously very complex processes involved in interpreting that underlie these, as well, the problems of meaning, if you like, it may be that they're going to be too difficult for neuroscientists to get at, or that there's some barrier in principle against their doing so. But on the whole, I mean, my prejudices are that philosophers have spent centuries saying this, that, or the other can't be done by science. I'm not sure. I'll wait and see. If it turns out that there are these barriers, then hooray, I don't need worry about this invasion of privacy. Mm-hmm. But I should say, I vividly remember my grandfather, who was in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, my grandfather telling me why it was that space travel couldn't happen. And it was something to do with, well, the way you steer an aeroplane has something to do with the air around. I'm just showing what a terrible non-scientist I am. Something or other to do with the air around. And in space, there's no air, so you couldn't steer. So no good trying to... but anyway, somehow that's turned out to be wrong. So I'm not sure whether to say optimistic or pessimistic that some of this kind of thing might happen.
So let's go to the second question I had in that context. Let's assume that it will become possible to do that. You defined it as a problem, ethical problem of privacy. I think it's even more radical. I mean, for me, such a state of the world in which we could read each other's thoughts, feelings, everything, you will become completely transparent to me and I to you. That would break the idea of the individual altogether. It will mean dissolution of the individual. Don't you think so? It's not only that your privacy will be invaded in the ways it is already invaded by various technological means, but you would lose the sense of self because I would have the same mental states as you. I'll be able to read your mental states and consciousness in the same way as you do. by definition. So what's the difference between you and me?
That's a very powerful question. I would like to precede trying to answer it by saying that this issue is one which I talked about in that book, and it's one where I really think I got it radically wrong. Because what I said in the book was that it seems frightening to know that everyone will be able to read each other's thoughts. But if we're all in that position, of course, what I was thinking of was, we don't want people reading our embarrassing sexual fantasies or whatever it is. But if we're all in that position, then the inhibition about it, the embarrassment and so on might go. But I now think that I was very shallow in just rubbishing it in that way. I've been thinking this particularly because recently I've been writing a book trying to respond to Edward Snowden's revelations about surveillance and the hugely invasive surveillance things that have been developed. And thinking about the value of privacy, I now think that there are all sorts of things which I hadn't really thought about. I mean, for instance, the American legal philosopher Charles Fried pushes the idea, which is a very interesting idea, I think, that relationships depend upon us deciding how much to give to other people, that intimacy and relationships depend on me not, I don't tell everybody my innermost thoughts, but I do tell my innermost thoughts, or nearly all of them, to people close to me. But now turning to your very deep and interesting question, would it mean there was no more individuality? I wonder. I mean, it might be that, supposing you and I disagree on this issue, as I think, once again, I'm not holding the thing.
That's okay.
I think there's a degree of disagreement between us on this. If I noticed that you were thinking it, rather than having to hear you say it, and you noticed me disagreeing with it by neurotransparency, I think we'd still be different. You'd be the person who thinks one thing, I'd be the person who thinks another thing.
Well, what would it mean that, say, you and me, if we are completely transparent in any act of consciousness? The I is something which, the self-reflection is something which individuates me.
Well, I agree.
Well, it's. Okay.
I agree that we partly create ourselves in private. That's to say, also one of the things I'm struck by with undergraduates often, first-year undergraduates particularly, they've left their home, they've come to university, and they do all sorts of weird experiments. They suddenly have green and orange hair where they didn't before, or they take drugs they weren't taking before, or whatever it is. And quite often, by the time they're 35, say, they're slightly embarrassed by having gone through this process. So I think it's rather good that quite often things we do, we experiment in private before having to show it in public. Virginia Woolf, in her book, A Room of One's Own, talks about even a brilliant writer like Jane Austen was glad that there was a stair that creaked when people came up to her room, because it gave her the chance to push away the papers so people wouldn't say, "Oh, what are you writing? Let me have a look," because she wanted to create in private. So I agree with that sort of thing, but I'm still not quite clear why it is that we have become the same person. In a nudist colony, people can see bits of each other's bodies that in general public life they don't.
Only the bodies, not
Only the bodies, but I'm not sure why seeing the mind has to be so different.
well. I'll move to the next question, and we can discuss it over dinner.
I totally,
Losing individuality.
I totally accept. I haven't provided a decisive refutation of your criticism. You may well be right.
It's just the self-reflective or self-conscious is what constitutes the cogito, if you like. It's not that you have a central mental state, but you have a mental state of your mental state. If that is transparent to me, then I don't see the difference between you and me. Because then, unless you say, well, it's the body, the physical space, which you take seriously, but as a mental state, I see a problem here. Anyway, that's not yet with us, even with the most advanced neuroscientists. I want to move maybe to one of before last question, or maybe the last question. Your more recent book on humanity and the 20th century, it's a terrible history of the human evil in the 20th century, which is, most of us have experienced part of it, at least, depending on our age. But again, I'm interested in the more theoretical background or assumptions behind the book. You mentioned, but you don't put focus on the huge benefits and progress and welfare and knowledge that we have advanced in the 20th century. So now the question becomes, how can we balance the two of them? Because it was definitely the most murderous, let's say, century in the history of humanity, but also the most quickly advancement in technology and welfare and life expectancy, etc. So is there any way to balance them? And the deeper question, I think, philosophically speaking, is, can we at all say, it goes back to the first question about person affecting value, can we really say that it was a worse century than the 19th century or the 5th century BC or whatever period since we compare apple and oranges and we compare different people for whom this or that century was good or evil?
Well, first, I agree. I didn't say whether it was the worst century or not, because my project was to, we all agree that a number of pretty terrible public atrocities, from 2 world wars, a genocide, other genocides, endless civil wars, all sorts of cruelty and torture. We all agree that that happened. And I, of course, agree that huge progress in other fields, medicine in all sorts of ways, is incredibly advantageous to the human race and became increasingly so during that century. But what I was concerned with was to try to look at the psychology, because, on the whole, I drew hugely on the work of historians, because I'm not a historian, and I read as widely as I could, but there are obviously very severe limitations to that. But I was trying to see, are there psychological patterns which will give us ethical lessons to take away? Why is it that certain wars occurred? Why is it, in detail, that why did people become Nazis? What were both the social and historical circumstances, but also the individual psychology? What made them dump the inhibitions most of us would have about those kinds of things? So that my exploration was to look for patterns so that we can warn ourselves against naive, rigid belief systems, warn ourselves against the evil consequences often of tribalism, warn ourselves against lack of imagination. So the thrust of the book wasn't really about this, but you're quite right, David, to raise a question. How can we make these comparisons? You say, can we balance them? In a way, I'm not interested so much in, as it were, does the 20th century score minus 90, whereas the 5th century BC only scores minus 60 or whatever, because I'm not sure how one can do such balancing. You probably know Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he produces an enormous amount of very impressive evidence, in my view, that in many ways we are very lucky to live in the modern world. The 20th, really, he concentrates on the post-Enlightenment period, but as it were, since the rise of humanitarian ideas in the Enlightenment and the rise of science, the two things together have in many ways meant that we live much, average life expectation is enormously greater. I don't know that I can do any balancing. I think that somebody being murdered in Auschwitz would be offended if one says, well, actually, this is outweighed in the surface, in evaluating the 20th century by the progress. I don't want to say that kind of thing, but I do, of course, accept that the simple, crude picture that the 20th century was the most disastrous ever, that applies in some circumstances, in some aspects, but not others. And what I think worries me is that the technology, it's a technology that makes it possible for a few evil people to bring about catastrophe. And we haven't yet developed adequate means for controlling that technology. I mean, only a few weeks ago, I was thinking whether or not a nuclear war breaks out depends upon two mad fanatics.
Yes. Finally, back to strict bioethics. It's in a way, I want to repeat the question addressed to Baroness Warnock by Yael in the previous exchange. Do you believe in moral expertise? Do you think we philosophers can have something beyond maybe the neutrality or the absence of vested interests, which is very important, of course, in chairing committees or taking part in committees? Do we have anything in substance to offer to
we being philosophers, right?
Philosophers,
yes.
In bioethics.
I mean,
yes, and that of course reflects on the general question of whether philosophers or moral philosophers like you have any, or may have, or should have any authority on moral issues in public life.
Well, first I should say I was very glad that Mary chaired that committee. It came to enormously beneficial results in a rational way. But I think that philosophers have certain, I wouldn't want committees to be entirely composed of philosophers, and I'm sure what Mary said indicated that she wouldn't either. She was glad to have people like Anne McLaren on the committee. But I think philosophers have certain really important qualifications. Often, alas, they have a rather large disqualification as well. The qualifications philosophers have, I'm not always, they're bad philosophers, just they're bad scientists. But what I hope good philosophers bring is firstly a background of having thought a lot about what it means to say someone has a right to something, trading off how are consequences all that matter, or do intentions matter, the whole range of things which philosophers have thought a lot about, so have a special expertise. And that, I think, is not the only expertise needed, but it makes, I think, for a good chair of such a committee. On the other hand, and this is something which in a way I try to resist in my later work, quite a lot of philosophers have no clue about people at all. I'll say one thing, I shouldn't really sort of take a particular example, but I've already praised Derek Parfit. I've already praised Derek Parfit. Derek Parfit was the nearest thing I've known to a genius in philosophy. Utterly brilliant. But he wasn't all that great at knowing what other people were like. So that, for instance, one time when I was at New College and he was round the corner in All Souls College, I thought I'd like to, there's some big dinner at New College to invite guests to, so I thought I'd invite Derek. And so I called him up, and he really didn't want to come. And I knew that this was because he was so committed to his work. He really was an amazing kind of, he used to read philosophy books while brushing his teeth and all that kind of thing. But he didn't want to hurt my feelings. So he said, no, I don't think really I want to come. Of course, there's nothing I should like more than to spend an evening talking to you. But unfortunately, if I came to this dinner, I'd have to talk to other people as well. And I have my degree of vanity and self-deception, but I found it hard to believe that the human universe consisted just of me on the one hand, who he'd love to talk to, and all these other appalling other people who, was such a waste of his time. Now, he was a lovely person, and I'm not trying to attack him at all. He's a lovely person. I admired him enormously. He was a friend. But you've got to be a little clueless about people to think that anyone's going to believe that particular excuse. And, I've known lots of philosophers. I won't go on with anecdotes of this kind, but, there are hordes of philosophers. I wouldn't want them to help my children cross the road. And so, in one way, I don't want to sort of boast about myself, but I've tried, maybe unsuccessfully, but the mode of moral philosophy which consists of trying to test abstract principles by elaborate thought experiments, far-fetched science fiction thought experiments. That was, in a way, the method I used in the book about genetic engineering and whatnot. But I've increasingly come to think that what philosophy needs is actually something a bit more empirical about what people are like. So that in the book about the humanity, about 20th century history, I try to look at what went wrong in the people, in the psychology of people who did these terrible things. And more recently, I've written a book on mental illness, trying to see what it's like from the inside, trying to understand psychology. Philosophy should be done in many different ways. This is only one. I'm not trying to impose it on anyone else. But I hope that's a kind of rough answer to your question. I probably overrun it.
The conclusion is Derek Parfit would not be chairing a committee, fertilization or any public affair.
I don't want to finish on a negative note about Derek. He was a wonderful friend, and you and I have both benefited from him in that class.
Thank you, Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor David Head and to Professor Jonathan Glover, our Jonathan and David and Jonathan. We don't have a machine to read minds, but I have a good sense of what's on your mind. So two things probably. One is, who would expect, I'm sure not all of us would, that a discussion with philosophers could be so interesting. So this is on the one side, so we've heard two philosophers. And the second one is, I hope we're not having another philosopher now, and we're not. So our next laureate, is Professor Ezekiel Emanuel. Please join us up here. Let me just say a few words. Professor Emanuel is Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and the Diane V.S. Levi and Robert M. Levi University Professor and Chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a physician, a policymaker, a scholar, founded no less than 2 departments of bioethics, one at the National Institute of Health and one at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Emanuel is renowned for advancing the field of bioethics by combining his skills as a physician and a policymaker. He is a pioneer in the fields of end-of-life care, public health, and specifically medical care and insurance. Also has contributed a great deal to the ethics of medical research. He has published over 300 scholarly articles, authored 6 books, and is the most cited bioethicist in the world. His books include, among others, and the titles here I think are revealing, so I'll just mention a few of them: Reinventing American Healthcare, How the Affordable Care Act Will Improve Our Terribly Complex, Blatantly Unjust, Outrageously Expensive, Grossly Inefficient, Error-Prone System, also Healthcare Guaranteed, A Simple Secular Solution for America, and his memoir, Brothers Emmanuel. He is also the editor of the Oxford textbook on clinical research ethics. Professor Emmanuel is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the chair of the Meta Council on the Future of Healthcare, committed to the World Economic Forum. He is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine and many other contributions to the field. His career is marked by an unusual ability to blend scholarship, teaching, and policy work, and he has had a profound influence on public discourse. I will have the honor of having a conversation with Professor Emmanuel. I am here from the law school and also the director of the Veneer Institute. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So I first came across your work when I was a graduate student at Berkeley over 20 years ago. I was writing my work on the history of euthanasia, and the only existing serious contribution to the history of euthanasia in the United States was a piece that you had written. And I remember even at the time asking myself, why would a medical physician decide to contribute their life to bioethics? It's one thing when philosophers do that, and Baroness Warnock has said philosophers who are not committed to anything worldly, but it's another thing for a physician who can actually save lives to decide to move to the field of bioethics. So I want to ask you, how did it come about that you decided to devote much of your life to bioethics, and how important do you see bioethics?
Well, there's a sort of autobiographical answer, which is I'm the oldest born child of a Jewish immigrant father in the United States, and that almost guarantees I had to be a doctor. So my parents very much wanted me to be the doctor in the family. And given that I had 2 brothers who were talented but not talented in science, it fell upon me to become the doctor. But I did not actually like the idea of treating people. I divide the world into 2 types: people who like to handle and help other people address their problems individually. My father is that kind of person. He really loves people individually and solving their problems. My eldest daughter is like that. I prefer to solve policy problems and then by that help people individually. And so being a doctor, caring for patients one-on-one, even though I enjoyed the patients very much, did not appeal to me. So that's sort of how I got to the sort of situation. And why bioethics? When I was doing my clinical work, it became obvious to me that we were doing a horrible job, and in particular at that time a horrible job, this was in the early to mid 1980s, a horrible job on end-of-life care, that we were resuscitating the wrong people, that we couldn't even think about it clearly, and that I thought I could contribute to that. I had done an undergraduate degree in chemistry and philosophy, so I thought I could have special abilities to address the problem by bringing together the 2 halves of my previous work. So I took off from medical school and worked on political philosophy.
So people who are familiar with the field of bioethics know that a lot of bioethics is about individual rights, and specifically a lot of the research in bioethics has focused on beginning and end of life. And your research too, to an extent, has also dealt with topics, especially at the end of life. But I think there's a move, or at least some of us see a move from discussing these issues on the individual basis to discussing questions of public health and public policy as central questions to bioethics. And your contribution in this sense is important. As I mentioned in the introduction, your discussions of medical care and medical insurance is one example. The distribution of scarce resources is another. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and about your specific interests within the broader field of bioethics.
Well, first of all, you'll look really long and hard in almost all of my writing for the use of the word rights. I try to avoid the use of the word rights because I don't like to think about everything as a right here and a right there, because I think, first of all, it tends to be a club, and which rights you have and what the limits of those rights, I think, are much more important. So I tend to avoid thinking about that. And I also think I'm generally not as clever as Jonathan in sort of imagining worlds and trying to figure out what the right answer is in the future imagined world. And believe me, I think that actually one of our biggest problems is we don't do enough imagining. So I do think that the part of the problem of how to answer issues about neuroethics or genetic enhancements and things like that is that it's very difficult for us to imagine what will the world look like if that happens and it becomes a standard practice and everyone becomes inculcated in that standard practice. I'm not that kind of person. I don't do science fiction. I can't think science fiction like. I do think what I have a capacity to do is to stand back a little bit and say, all right, what are the values at stake here? How should we, given these values, how do we think about the multiple values that are at stake? And then what would it look like when played out in the real world? And that's what I think I've tried to do most, is to figure out what the right answer is and then how to play it out either in a policy way or practically in the real world. So I think in just to give a concrete example, I began working on the allocation of absolutely scarce resources like organs for transplantation or flu vaccine in the case of a pandemic when I went to a presentation by someone talking about the American government's policy towards allocating flu vaccines should we have another pandemic. And this was in 2005, 2006, and the guy who wrote the government policy was presenting on it, and it just became obvious to me when he set out the hierarchy that, top of it would, of course, be people who, doctors and nurses who save lives, people who keep the communication system going, people who keep the food flowing and water flowing, and that below that would be people who were 65 years and older and had health problems, and that they were most likely to die, and so they should get the vaccine. And then you go down the list, funeral directors, and then healthy people. And below funeral directors is healthy people. And I'm saying that can't possibly be right. That's got to be wrong, that the last people to get a vaccine would be healthy people, and that the only principle they were using was, we got to minimize the number of deaths. And I was like, that can't be the right principle. So I got thinking, all right, so if that's not the right principle, what is the various principles? And then working backwards to figure out, okay, going from both sides. So what are the other principles that might be at stake? Prognosis and saving the most life years, and then working at the other end. Well, if I had limited resources, I want to save children first because they're going to live a long time, and they don't have multiple health problems and haven't lived a complete life already. So I figured out what the principles are and then what the right principles are. Good to say the federal government then did change its policy.
So one of the topics that you have been fighting for and writing about, including in your book, Healthcare Guaranteed, is universal health coverage. So I want to bring us from the world of principles to the reality, the political reality, and ask you to what extent was the Obama reform known as Obamacare a realization of what you had fought for, and to what extent is this reform in jeopardy?
Well, in jeopardy, I think the answer is not much. I think there's been an overplay, including by President Trump, of what the Republicans have done. It's still largely the framework of the healthcare system. What President Trump has done is made sure that the sort of engine of reform is no longer in the United States federal government. It's moved to the sort of private sector in the United States. And so if you want to help change the system, you have to work within the private sector. I think if you're, and this might go back to a question that both the Baroness and Professor Glover had got it addressed. I think one of the big mistakes academics in general, and not just philosophers, can make when they come into the public policy realm is to be doctrinaire about their solution. I have a healthy skepticism about democracy ever producing an A bill, a very good bill. Certainly no perfect bill. There are always compromises, and one needs to be, if you're going to get into the public policy world, willing to make compromises. I think the most important thing I learned is the question is what you're doing making the world better or going in the other direction? And as long as you're making the world better and improving the world, then what you're doing has good justification, even if it's not exactly your ideal situation. So I think it's always important to be willing to give up your ideal to get something that's going to be better and one hopes substantially better. So the Affordable Care Act is not very closely related to what I wanted, but in many respects, but it definitely made the world better. And so I think that's an important thing to be aware of when you move into the policy realm. You can't necessarily get the ideal, but you can get substantial improvements along the way. The second thing I think that's very important, political scientists, which I was trained as partially, they have this concept called path dependence. Reforms, we philosophers can think about reforms separate from institutional structures of a society. But when you're actually making reforms, you are stuck with the institutional structures of society. And it's a very rare society that will completely destroy a set of institutional structures and put in something totally different. So if you're making public policy reforms in a society, you're stuck with the institutional structures, and your reform typically can modify them but cannot completely change them. And so in the United States, we're stuck with a very complicated, multiple-headed monster in the healthcare field, and you're stuck with having to work within that set of constraints. Occasionally, when you're standing up a brand new program with no prior institutional structures, you can invent them, but that's a rare moment.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit about comparative bioethics, so to speak. And we were just talking about the American case, and I think the American case is central. And when we think about Israel and the United States, obviously in many aspects and in many domains, there's a very strong influence of American culture and politics, even models of leadership, one may argue, American influencing Israel.
Well, I thought it's the reverse here. We got Trump after Netanyahu.
Maybe. So we were talking for a long time about Clinton and Netanyahu. Maybe swings in different directions. But the point is that when it comes to bioethics, Israelis are quite shocked by the way bioethics questions are dealt with in the United States, the positions, but also the prominence of bioethical debates to American politics. The obvious example is the centrality of abortion to American politics, dividing left and right. But end-of-life decision-making has also become a highly politicized question in American politics. Obviously, what we had just discussed, the questions of medical insurance become prominent issues that organize American politics in a way that isn't the case in Israel, despite the strong influence of religion also on Israeli politics. But we don't have the same kind of bioethical debates, nor the prominence of these debates in Israeli politics. So I wonder whether you could reflect on this, from the American side and explain to an Israeli audience, some insight on how that works?
Well, I do think, to defend my country, I do think the questions of bioethics are in some ways the most fundamental and fundamentally interesting ethical questions out there. They are, as Jonathan's book says, they're about creating life and killing people. They're about allocating scarce resources and who's going to die, who's not going to die. They're about manipulating human beings and the question of whether you end up with the same person or a different person. I mean, I think all the questions are fundamentally among the most interesting questions about life that you can get. So the fact that they're central in the United States only suggests, well, this is a group of people who really think these questions matter, and they matter publicly. So that's one issue, and I do think the American bioethics has got an outsized field. I think the issue of the sort of level of conflict and the level of controversy over these questions does go back to the abortion debate. And it does go back to the fact that the United States is a much more pluralistic country than any other country, I think, in the world. Not pluralistic necessarily in where people come from, but pluralistic in the sense of, capaciousness for value differences, right? Israel's got 8 million people, not all of them, but the vast majority of them of Jewish heritage. Israel's pluralism is there for sure, but it's constrained. The United States, 320 million people, vast range of religions, and the spark of the abortion debate really unleashed a lot of the conflict among those value positions, and it has persisted now for 45 years, and it still is the nidus that brings out the divides. Having said all that, and I explored this issue of why we seem in the United States not able to resolve bioethical dilemmas in my book, The Ends of Human Life, which was all about the sort of value pluralism and the extent of it in the United States and the fact that we don't have a shared framework for solving it. There has, and I probably got it wrong in that book, or at least premature, there has been a kind of resolution about end-of-life care. It is quite clear that despite the hysteria of the far right about cases like Terry Schiavo, in that case, the far right, the evangelical community, and their ideological counterparts overplayed their hand, and the vast majority of Americans said, look, this is a matter between the patient, the family, and the doctor. It's not a matter for the Supreme Court. It's not a matter for the Senate. It's not a matter for the governor of Florida. It's a matter that's best dealt with in private, and people may have different views about it, and that's perfectly okay with the American polity, and we're going to let them decide. You want to keep your family on respirator forever? Okay. You don't? You want to pull out the respirator? Okay, we're going to accept that too. Now, when there's a conflict within a family, we don't have a great solution for that problem. But in this case, we have a very clear order of who makes decisions for someone who's incompetent. The husband made the decision, and everyone, the vast majority of the population that was the position they took, and they were very happy with it. And I would say, subsequently, there really hasn't been a similar blow up, because I think it just totally backfired on the right.
So I want to ask you a follow-up that moves from the United States to Israel. Now, as an outside observer of Israeli society, you are no foreigner to Israeli society. You have connections to this country. And I wanted to ask you whether, not quite the question that Yael asked, although it would be nice if you have some tips for us, but maybe you have some insight about the kind of questions that we're struggling with in the field of bioethics, medical research, public health, the kind of question that you're interested
Far be it for me to comment without sufficient knowledge about the details. I did spend last night talking to people from the Ministry of Health trying to figure out the craziness of the Israeli healthcare system and whether it can be remedied or not. But it did remind me very much that, at least on the healthcare system side of the world, every healthcare system has its strengths and every healthcare system has its own disasters, own challenges, which is why when I get asked in the United States, well, what country has the world's best healthcare system? I say, terrible question, right? That they all have some positives and all have some challenges, and they're all likely to continue to have positives and challenges because the costs are just spiraling out of control everywhere. Even if the United States is well ahead of the rest of the world, the pressures on every country because of medical costs are high, requiring choices that we really, really, really hate making as people. I notice that when I teach my students about allocating scarce resources and organs, they absolutely cannot stand the fact that if they give it to one person, the other person will die. So they're always trying to, well, can we cut it in half? And it's like, you can't cut a heart in half. It doesn't work. But I do think a large part of the choices that we're going to have to make about allocating resources as the pressures increase are going to be very, very unpalatable to people. So on that note, I would say one needs to understand the context. The other thing I would say about Israeli society, and this got to the question of a standing committee, we have had standing bioethics commissions in the United States. Trump is the first president not to have one. I think in general, the early ones were very helpful. So the very first one defined the sort of rules of research ethics, the rules set in the United States, and I think largely adopted throughout the world. I do have to say I get a little nervous, and here I maybe differ from the Baroness. I do think there's been a somewhat international breakdown around research ethics in the world. And, in the 70s and 80s, when a lot of new technologies were coming on, the dominant researchers, right, in the world, the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Sweden, Israel even, there was a sort of shared cultural consensus, a shared understanding, for lack of a better word, and I know that many people scream at me for, there was a Western approach that built, in some ways, you can trace back to the Enlightenment. Now, research is much wider, much bigger. We've had a bunch of sort of questionable issues using CRISPR in China, well ahead of any consideration. We've had stem cell use in Korea. And one gets the sense that the sort of consensus, we make a consensus before we take a big leap in experimentation. I think it's broken down. And I've given you my explanation. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it does make me worried that lots of the United States could develop research rules and then more or less broadly adopted in the West, and then now it's not clear that those kind of things are gonna survive. The ability to sort of have a shared, and the Chinese have made quite clear, well, we might not agree with your research ethics rules. So and that's, I think, a dangerous situation for all of us.
I see. So that's where you differ. I mean, that the plurality here, you think, is a danger, not a...
Yes, and that's where I differ from the Baroness, who I think was a little more optimistic than I am about the shared views going forward.
So speaking about controversies, you have not avoided controversies. In the past, you have been vehemently attacked by the right, by the fundamentalist right, on your alleged positions on euthanasia in the context of the death penalty and death panels. That is, that doctors would be encouraged to discuss with their patients how they want to end their lives in a way that was perceived by some people as promoting possibilities of euthanasia and doctors as killers.
And be paid for by the government, by the way.
By the government. And I think your position there was falsely construed to an extent on questions of euthanasia, at least, not on the panels. But occasionally you've also been attacked by at least an approach on the left on principles of equality. And this goes back to what you mentioned, but we didn't go into the details, and perhaps this will give you an opportunity to say a little bit more about the distribution of scarce resources. And in that context, one of the questions is, where do the elderly stand in questions of distribution of scarce organs? And you took a position, if I have it right, that it's legitimate to, so to speak, discriminate against elderly people, that they shouldn't have the same privilege as young people have on these questions. I'd like to hear more your position on this, maybe a little bit about the controversy and where you stand today.
I stand in the same place I stood before, and I don't. I reject the term discriminate against the elderly. They just don't have as high a priority, but it's not a matter of discrimination. It's not. I think if you ask the question, who should get a scarce resource in a life or death situation, and what principles ought you to use, it seems to me that one of the principles that stands in very high priority is you give it. So think of the values at stake. There's equality. There's sort of maximizing good. There's benefiting the worst off, and there's some instrumental values. And it seems to me that at least one of the plausible principles we ought to consider is to give organs to the least well off, where children are the least well off in the sense that they've lived the least life. And that therefore they ought to get priority, whereas an elderly person has lived their life, if not their full life, pretty close to their full life, and they ought to get lesser priority because they've been fortunate enough to get a full life. I think that's actually quite a plausible principle, and I might say I have used a test case of this. You have one liver to give, you've got three people, a 2-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 70-year-old, who gets it? And I've done this in scores of countries now, and I remember when I did it in China, the head said, well, we shouldn't do this. Of course the old person will get it. I said, I'm going to do it, and I'm not so sure you're right. And in fact, she wasn't right. It was, almost invariably the 20-year-old gets 2/3 to 80% of the people agree, and the young child gets the other 20%, and almost no one votes for the 70-year-old. It's not, the intuition, I think, is correct, which is young kids haven't had a lot of life to live, and the difference between the two and the 20-year-old, we can discuss the attachment to life, how much they've invested, the attachment to the future, the development of their own ideals and individuality. But that's the view I have. So I'm not discriminating against the old, but I do think priority ought to be given to the young, and I hold that position today, and nothing has induced me to change my position. And I will say that when we articulated that position and the American government was irritated, one of the ironies of that is I worked for the American government and was criticizing the American government's policy, which my boss didn't like. They then went out and did some interviews of average Americans to try to find out, is this crazy guy right, or, was our original policy right? They changed their policy closer to mine precisely because most Americans agree, we ought to prioritize children.
So I have a follow-up, but perhaps this will go for a dinner conversation, because there's a question of the quantifiable aspects of a full life experience, and there's also a qualitative aspect of full life experience. And I also wonder whether people's opinions about this changes as people get older, and then that's also I don't know if you want to follow up on this. I wonder what the audience thinks, but we can leave that for another discussion. Let me move to one of the topics that I know you've been most recently interested in, and that is questions of ethics in medical research. And you actually were here a year and a half ago, I think, as a guest of Tel Aviv University to discuss questions of medical research. You've spoken now about China and Korea, but maybe you can say more about where in the American context or generally, where you stand on these questions. I know that a lot of bioethics has focused on informed consent and questions on informed consent, and some of this is now being questioned, so maybe a little bit more about that. And there are people here who sit on ethics committees and may be interested.
So, yeah, I would say that one of the consequences in the United States, at least, and actually I think in the world in general, is we think about research ethics after a scandal, right? So the world began thinking about research ethics after the Nazi medical atrocities, and we got the Nuremberg Code. And some people thought that was some overreach in the Nuremberg Code, and so we got the Declaration of Helsinki as a kind of rethink by the medical profession. Then in the United States, we had this the infamous Tuskegee experiment, where it turned out it wasn't so much an experiment, it was a natural history study just following African-American men who had syphilis and not treating them even though there was a treatment available. And the question was, we then created a national commission to look into that and make recommendations about the ethics of research and what the regulations ought to look like, because we had no regulations in the United States. And those regulations principally devolved into two parts, one part of which was you create an IRB or an ethics research committee or something that independently reviews the protocol and the research before it starts, so that it's not the researcher who determines whether it's ethical or not. And the second is that the individual ought to be giving informed consent unless there's a good reason they can't. They're children, they have Alzheimer's, and the research is important. And then we have some other mechanisms, always controversial about what should go. And I've always thought that this issue of informed consent, very important, but way overstated and way too much pressure put on it. And it's the only thing people recognize as a violation. They didn't give informed consent. And it seems to me that there's a previous question, which is separate from the informed consent: was the research ethical? And so I do think one of my contributions to bioethics has been say, all right, what are the questions you ask and what order do you ask them? And you have to consider what's the social value of the research. Is it a valuable study or not? Because if it's not a valuable study, it doesn't matter whether they gave informed consent or not. Shouldn't have done it. Was it scientifically rigorous? Was it going to give you data, or was it going to give you garbage? Because you can't put people at risk for garbage. And then there's, just selection of subjects. You have to choose your people fairly and justly, and that usually means that you shouldn't select only African-American sharecroppers when anyone. You can follow the natural history of anyone. You shouldn't only go to orphanages. You shouldn't do a lot of the things that had been done traditionally to do research, even great research. But I think the most important principle has always been, the research got risks and benefits, and how do they pan out? And I think that's the principle. It turns out if you look at all of bioethics, we have the hardest time delineating and quantifying, and yet I think it's the most important principle, much more important than informed consent, I would say. And because you don't really worry about informed consent if the research has minimal risks or no risks at all, and a lot of research has no risks at all. And so I have spent a lot of time trying to think about the risk-benefit ratio, how you would actually quantify it, what we should do to quantify it. And I think that's the value of that also is it's pretty objective. And I've also been critical of informed consent, because what ends up happening if informed consent gets all the weight, we end up with these long informed consent documents, everyone gets confused, and it really, it turns out, if you look at it empirically, most people make their decision whether they're going to participate in research long before they get to the informed consent document. It's largely irrelevant for many, many people. So
we don't have a lot of times, and I'd like to at least offer the possibility to the audience that's been sitting so patiently and quietly throughout this to ask questions. I know also that Professor Manuel would appreciate a question or two from the audience to the extent that we have time. I'd like to conclude my questions with looking into the future. Now, I know you just said a few minutes ago that you don't like the practice of foreseeing the future, but not the far future, not the science fiction future, but the one that is closer to us. And both ask you, what's your next topic of concern in the field of bioethics? Where do you think the stakes are high and bioethical intervention is required? And also, somewhat related, of the role of experts in bioethics and intellectuals in a world that is, I think, becoming more and more populist and where there is much less room for a serious academic study of these questions influencing the general audience.
So first of all, I do think this issue of how we value, rank medical interventions versus everything else society needs to do is a fundamentally important question. And it is a very deep question on the allocation of resources, which we tend to avoid. That's what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. And again, it does get into some intergenerational questions of how much goes to the young, how much goes to the old, because a lot of government policies have that character in them. If a lot of money goes to pensions, it perforce goes to the elderly. If it doesn't, if it goes to education, it perforce goes to young people. And those kind of choices, I think, are really hugely value-laden choices, and we almost totally ignore them. And I think for a whole series of reasons, they're actually quite, at least in the United States, you can see them happening when legislatures and governors and presidents have to make budgetary choices. So that's something that I will spend a lot of time. And Jonathan, I think, mentioned one of the issues, which I do think is going to be fundamentally important over the next few years, and that's this sort of relationship between man and machine. And the relationship with AI, the relationship with potentially machines more powerful than men, and I think we don't understand how to think about them. I don't think we've done a good job of what would society look like under those circumstances, and you get a lot of really crappy answers. So I was in an audience once and heard Eric Schmidt, the former chairman of Google, say, "Oh, we would just pull the plug." That has got to be among the dumbest answers I've ever heard to a serious question. And even a huge misunderstanding of what the cloud computing really means and why the internet was invented, because no one can pull the plug. So I do think that is a fundamentally important question, and I do think similarly, if you get implants in the brain, what does that mean for human personality, human responsibility? I'm not sure. I am sure. I'm not the person to answer those questions. I don't have the capacity to answer those questions, but I do think someone's got to begin, and it really does require a lot of imagination about what society will look like.
Great. So we have 6 minutes, and I'd like to use 2 or 3 of those to allow people from the audience to have a say or pose a question as we.
Thank you. My question to you would be the role of NGOs. So I think you wrote a very interesting paper looking at interests and biases and whatever, and I'm wondering how you view the importance of NGOs in the bioethical discussion and policy making, and to what extent do they have the role that we think that they should have, or is it just a tool? Or how do you see that?
Zeke, we'll take a
couple of questions. Yeah, fine. I'll try to remember them.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to relate to the two of you and maybe combine the points to make the question very short. If I want a title instead of end of life, healthy aging, in the consideration, and I want to put the environment and the consciousness that Jonathan was talking, and the involvement of engineering into the body, whether it's AI or any other equipment, and then have to make the decision that you were talking about, because the environment is a big interference in our quality of life, and this is the main issue. not how long we live, but rather the quality of life, and then the consciousness, and then the involvement of the AI. And I want to put as the major concern, or maybe the research broadband interference or collaboration in providing a healthy aging, not longevity, but rather quality of life. How with you both discussion and prioritize, and also transparency will be involved.
One last question, briefly.
Notice you wimped out.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you about the case that you spoke before about the aging in organ donation. And I think that your answer is perfectly fine with resources that are something like hospital beds or medicine, but in organs, there are the element of donation. And if you can take from an aged person, you need to provide him with or her with an organ. How do you consider this element in your consideration?
Three very different questions. So maybe I'll address this question of healthy aging. Look, I think it's very important to have healthy aging. And I think, in the abstract, if you ask an audience, is it quality of life or quantity of life? They always say quality of life, and then they always opt for quantity of life. I never want to die, or I may have a stream, or something crazy like this. I am somewhat infamous in the United States for saying, I think 75 is good enough, and stop trying to push the limits. And I think what we should do is instead of worrying about, what's the life expectancy of a country, we should say, well, we want 100% of the population to get to 75, and then we really don't care. We shouldn't care. And we want them to get to 75 and be, physically fit at 75. Part of the problem is people think, I'm going to get more years and they're all going to be in the 30s. Doesn't work that way. You get more years and they're all going to be in the 90s. If you look at what happens when we're, in general, and again, you're speaking about averages because we're, one of the great things about doing public policy is you can speak out about averages and you don't have to worry about the long tails, in part because, we're all average. There are a few, Baroness is one, there are a few people who are outliers. No, that's true, who are really outliers, publish books in their 90s, etc. They turn out to be incredibly rare. If you look at the actual curve of, productivity, mental functioning, etc., it's got a very usual curve, and it sort of amazingly ends at 75. Alzheimer's disease goes like this, and poof, at 75, and lots of things happen at 75. Physical functioning has actually deteriorated, not increased. So I'm all for healthy aging, but I'm not all for let's live longer ad mea versrim. Okay, that's the first thing. Remind me of your question. I had a good NGOs. I have a lot of trouble with NGOs, and I'll just put it out on the table. They do a lot of good, and as we've learned from Oxfam, they do a lot of bad. And part of the problem is there's not a lot of accountability for NGOs. They have, for a lot of reasons, wrapped themselves in the knight in shining armor. We're honest, we're the good guys, we're holding everyone else accountable. And the problem is that they make a lot of judgments, some of which I think are quite harmful. And there is no accountability that we've invented yet for NGOs. And we are now uncovering, Oxfam is only the most extreme case, of the fact that maybe not so good. I myself have some difficulty with Doctors Without Borders. They rush into emergency situations and then they leave. Well, wait a second, Emergencies may not be the right way to address things. It's very expensive to address emergencies. It doesn't leave permanent structures and institutions and things you need. They have slightly changed their view. They and I have big conflicts, for example, over using second best treatments in developing countries where they're cheap and you can get them to more people. They want only first best treatments in a lot of contexts. So I have a great deal of difficulty with NGOs making policy and decisions in the world. It's not to say they shouldn't be around the table, but like every other organization, I believe in accountability. And I think we ought to figure out a way to make them much more accountable than just to say, oh, they're the knight in shining armor, always doing good. They might be devoted to doing good, and we know many people who've been devoted to doing good end up doing a lot of bad along the way. And I'll give you one concrete example. I do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work in developing countries in Africa. And one of the big problems is you've got a lot of NGOs that come in. They hire the most talented people. They pay them a lot more. They give them a lot of resources, and they suck out human quality resources from operating in the country, teaching, providing actual care, etc. You know, along the way of doing good, they're actually doing this other thing, and we've never evaluated which is better. There are many highly respected people. I'll give you Angus Deaton, the recent Nobel Prize winner in economics, professor at Princeton, Scott, has written very, very negatively, not about NGOs per se, but just in general about global assistance, because he thinks it creates lots of problems, undermines democracy, undermines governmental accountability, and NGOs are, I think, very much in that ballpark. So I myself am conflicted about what they do. Okay, we're over.
We're almost out of time. So there was another question, I know. So we will have to leave that perhaps for a short discussion after the event, because it is now 6:30, and I would like us to adjourn on time. So let me thank our laureates and their discussants, Baroness Mary Warnock and Professor Yaela Shiloni-Dolev, Professor Jonathan Glover, and Professor David Head. Thank you very much, Professor Ezekiel Emanuel. Thank you, audience. You've been wonderful. Good evening.